Our children
seem to be able to interpret things that we as adults lose.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
Now, one of the things, you teamed up with Catherine Cushman for this book. How did you happen to all get together?
Well, I knew that this was such a new venture for me. I mean, when I started writing children's books, that was like a completely new venture, and I think I went and researched and bought the top 10 books on writing children's fiction and studied, and I thought, there's a learning curve here. Mm-hmm. And when it came to fiction, I knew that I could not simply dive in and know that I would understand the genre. So I talked to my book agents, Alive book agents, and I said, I would love to have the company of walking with another woman through this process. So they said, okay, then we will send you 10 books by women that we think are really fabulous that you might relate to. So read them all and let us know which one rings a bell with you. And when I read Catherine's book, I thought, oh, I love this woman. And I liked the way she told a story. I liked the words she used. I loved the way she painted a picture. And so we talked on the phone for some time, and then she was kind enough to fly in, and we spent a day together. And we just brainstormed. And it became clear that we were very much on the same page in terms of how we wanted to tell this story and where we wanted to place the story. I said I'd really want to place it in Charleston, Catherine, because that's where my husband and I were married. It's a city that I've spent a lot of time in, and it's a city that I understand a little of the flavor of and what it feels like to walk those streets. So we just connected on very many levels, and it was clear to me that she would be the perfect partner.
It's interesting. I was wondering how you chose Charleston. Now, you also chose the direct opposite, New York City. Why did you choose New York City?
Because I thought if you imagine two sisters who have been raised in Charleston, and a lot of bad things have happened in the life of these girls. I mean, some very devastating moments. But one of them has chosen to hang on to the faith that her grandmother had and embraces her life in Charleston. The other wants to get away from everything that city means. And I think for her the polar opposite was New York, because where Charleston is old and history and relationships and Southern charm, New York is, new people, clean lines, busy city. You don't have to make eye contact with people. You can get from point A to point B without ever having to say hello to anyone. I imagined that, we talked about where would Anne go if she wanted to run away from a city like Charleston. Where would she go? And we felt like New York was the perfect place.
Now, how did you and Catherine get together as far as writing the book or co-writing the book? Were you doing emails? Did you go on a retreat? How did you actually complete the process of writing the book together?
We did most of it really through email and phone conversations. I would draft out something and send it to Catherine, and she would look at it and make comments, and then we would agree on a certain section, and she would work on a section and send it to me, and then we would get on the phone and we'd talk about, okay, I think Ethan, I love the fact that Ethan is a strong believer, but he sounds just a little too religious-y to me, so let's work on that. I don't want him to be, I think he has enough insight and would care for Anne enough that he wouldn't use language that would alienate her. So let's rework all of that. And it became like a kind of literary tennis match. We would just both take turns and then throw it back. And then when we got pretty close, then Catherine said, okay, let me write out a final draft. And then I'll send it to you, and I'll send it to Amy McConnell, and we will all then spend, the next 2 weeks, we just literally went line by line and made our last-minute changes.
It's an extraordinary book. It really is. As a matter of fact, one of the things that happened certainly with me is I wanted to know a little bit more about the relationship with Anne and Ethan and where it was going to be going. And so that leads me to my next question is this going to be a series, or have you made any plans to that effect?
Well, that's an interesting question because I'm very invested in the characters, and we've talked about that. Do we simply leave them where they are, where there's obviously something happening between Anne and Ethan? Do we allow the reader to imagine where that would go? I'm not going to tell what happens with Keith, but there's quite a struggle with Keith at the end. What's going to happen with that? And I'll be honest with you and tell you we haven't completely decided yet. But if I had to throw my 2 cents in here, I would say I would love to see how the story further unfolds, because I think that even when you've been through a kind of a spiritual awakening, like Anne has at the end. There's definitely a moment when God gives her a very unusual gift. But I think, does that immediately wipe out all the questions? Does that answer everything? Because something that's clear to me is that I used to say as a teenager, if I had only been on the earth when Jesus walked on the earth, it would be so easy to believe, because you would actually see with your own eyes the miracles. But the more I have studied God's Word, the more it's clear to me that did not happen. Half the crowd who stood and watched Lazarus, who had been dead for 4 days, come out of the tomb, went to the Jewish authorities and said, you have to get rid of this man. This is getting totally out of control. So when God moves and does something dramatic, it doesn't necessarily mean that people always then embrace who God is. People can be left still with a lot of questions and a lot of struggles. And I would just love to see where Anne goes in the next part of her journey.
I would too, because one of the things she did is she, and I don't think this is a spoiler, but she promised her sister and her grandmother that she was going to live her life to the fullest. And I almost feel like, okay, now what else is she going to do?
Yeah, I know.
Now, one of the things I was just thinking about is that Anne had the same struggle with her mother that you actually had with your father.
Yes.
Was that done consciously or unconsciously? Did that enter into your thought process as you were writing this book?
Well, it's interesting because my struggle with my father was very much out of his hands. But as a child, I didn't understand that. I mean, he had no control over the blood clot that was moving across his brain. Anne's mother, but in many ways, she has an addiction to alcohol, and she's so struggling to get free from that. And one of the programs that I watch on TV, because there's something about human struggle that I am compelled by, is the program Intervention that's on A&E. And you can watch someone who has had this. Well, one of them in particular I think of is a guy who's a doctor who worked hard to get through medical school, did everything, and literally had come to the place finally in his life where all the work was beginning to pay off. But he had become addicted to prescription pain pills and was ruining his life. And everybody who loved him wanted to sit down and face him with the facts. Here's how hard you've worked. Here's what's before you. Here's what you're doing with this. And he was not able to shake free from this demon. And in some ways I see Anne's mother the same. She became a mother at quite a young age. And she has these 2 children, but she has this huge empty place inside her that she tries to fill up with relationships with men or with alcohol. And she is not able to get out of that place enough to be there for her daughters, and has left this legacy of brokenness and emptiness. And I guess there is something about that I find I always want to unwrap it more. And every time I unwrap it, I know that part of what's in the box is for me. I mean, I'm very aware of that. And it's one of the reasons that I love, like last night I started rereading the Somerset Maugham book of Human Bondage, because there's something about a story of a child who thinks, this little boy who has the clubfoot, Philip, who hears when he's 8 years old from the pulpit, asking you will receive, seeking you will find, knocking the door will be opened. So goes home and prays that night that God would heal his clubfoot, and wakes up the next morning knowing he's totally healed. And when he reaches down and discovers it's still there, it's like he no longer knows what to do because life no longer makes sense to him. And I think because I spend so much of my life speaking to women, there's a heart cry in me to understand a little bit more, and to be able to empathize, and to be able to sit with those who are hurting and not necessarily provide an answer, but just provide companionship, just another person with them on the journey.